When you're getting started as a game designer, I'm a huge proponent of spending as little money as possible doing that. Not only is spending money on things like courses or books or materials often a trap to waste time and procrastinate from doing the real work of learning how to design games and testing your own ideas, but also, in my opinion, a lot of these things aren't really worth what you would spend on them. But there is one thing that I think it's absolutely worth spending money on as a game designer, especially in the early stages of your career. And what is that one thing? It's going to conventions. Hi, I'm Matthew Dunstan. I'm a full-time board game designer based in Australia, and to date I've had over 60 games published all around the world in various languages. On this channel I like to talk about all things game design, from my experiences in the industry to tips and tricks to help you become a better game designer. In my opinion, the best bang for your buck in terms of spending money to what you're going to gain in experience, skills and relationships is going to conventions. I absolutely know it's not the cheapest thing that you could spend money on as a game designer, but it is by far the most effective thing you can do to level up your skills and become a better game designer and be a more integral part of the game design community. I'm going to split this video into two different parts. The first part is going to be going over the benefits you get from going to a convention, in my opinion, and some of the things that I've got from going to conventions in my career. And the second part is going to talk about some caveats as to why it might be a bit tough to go to a convention and some ways to maybe make the financial burden a little bit easier on yourself. The first massive advantage of going to a convention is that you just get to meet such a wide range of people in the board game hobby. You get to meet a lot of people who play games, who really enjoy playing games, and that they effectively are spending money to go to a convention and play games. And it can be so useful for you to not only meet these people, to share games with them, but to actually get to know maybe who might be in your target audience for the games you design. It can be all well and good having a theoretical avatar of a target audience member in your mind, but that will never compete with actually meeting and talking to real people, seeing what they like in games, and actually seeing them experience the games. It's one thing hearing people talk about games they like on a podcast or a video, and it's a completely separate thing to actually share a game experience with them. See all the non-verbal cues that they make as they play the game, things that they find exciting in the moment. I'm not saying that at a convention I sit down with a notepad every time and I make notes about how people are playing the games, but you do take a lot of these things in by osmosis, and you start to recognize some patterns, maybe some particular mechanics or themes that people really resonate with, and that can inform your own design practice. And potentially, if you can get people from this target audience to playtest your games, then that'll be incredibly useful feedback, because it's exactly the type of person that you're hoping will like your game, and what they think is particularly vital in terms of tailoring the experience for that type of player. And I think especially if you design heavier games which will appeal to a slightly more niche group of people, and generally that type of niche heavier gamer is the type of person that might go to a convention, you're going to get such a good opportunity to interact with that audience, whereas you might not have those types of gamers in your own groups of family and friends that you would normally interact with on a day-to-day basis. Another group of people that you get to interact with at conventions are people who work for publishers in different roles, whether that's that they run the company, whether they do marketing for the publisher, or they develop games for the publisher. And I should say that interacting with these folks isn't necessarily only about pitching your games to them. Obviously that's a huge benefit of going to a convention, being able to pitch your game in person to a publisher. But even outside of pitching, getting just to spend time around people who work in the industry can provide such knowledge and information that you can take in that will start to inform the way you approach game design and the types of games you make. It's a part of the industry that as a designer you don't get to see very often. You don't get to see the kinds of decisions that go into manufacturing games, what components get put into games, how games are marketed. And getting to meet the people who actually do those jobs and talk with them and get to know them can be incredibly valuable. And also at some conventions that maybe aren't as hectic as the really big conventions, these interactions don't have to be very transactional. You can just spend time with the people who work at publishers without trying to get something from them. And that's a way of actually beginning some sort of relationship with these people that isn't solely based on getting them to sign your game. I've talked about in a previous video that one of the most important things as a game designer that you're trying to do with a publisher is to establish a good relationship with them, that they feel like you're a trustworthy person to work with. And that has nothing to do with the games you make. And building that trust and relationship can be done in a convention setting. It might be the only way you get to spend time with these people because they most likely live a very far way away from you. And I mentioned it, but don't neglect other folks who work at publishers outside of those in game design or development. Because again, areas like marketing are so vital in terms of making a successful game, And it can be such an interesting insight that can help inform your own game design process. It's something that doesn't get talked about very much. You don't see many marketers going on board game design podcasts necessarily. And sometimes going to a convention and talking to the folks who are working in these positions is the only way to get those insights. And I'm going to say it again, just to be very, very clear. Don't approach these interactions as transactional as much as possible. See it simply as you being a part of the industry and them being a part of the industry and simply making a connection with them. I think people really hate the word networking because it implies this transactional nature of interacting with people, and you don't have to do it that way. Really take an interest in getting to know people, and you'll be surprised at what can follow later down the track as that relationship develops. And the last group of people, maybe the most important to interact with at a convention, are other designers. I can't understate how much I get from interacting with other designers at conventions. It's often the only way you get to spend extended periods of time hanging out with each other, chatting, and getting to know each other. And some of my best friendships and relationships in the board game community have started at conventions. Designers like Jeff Elias, who I designed Pioneer Rails with, we've only met at conventions. There's someone like Theo Rivera, who I met firstly as a publisher because he was working as a developer as a publisher and I pitched games to him. But subsequently, we just catch up as friends, as colleagues, as game designers working both in industry. And the only time we get to really spend time with each other socially is at conventions, because he lives on the other side of the world to me. It's probably obvious, but you can get so much from establishing these relationships with other game designers. Designers often make amazing playtesters, especially at early stages of prototypes. They could be potential collaborators if you're open to collaborating and co-designing games, which I've certainly benefited from a lot in my career. The majority of my games are co-designs. Or simply it's just a way to hang out with colleagues in the industry. Working as a game designer in the industry can be a very lonely process. Often you're just sitting alone in your office working on a game or writing emails. And being at a convention and meeting up with other game designers is really a chance to just sometimes let off steam, to talk about what's going on for you and to have someone who understands what the industry is like and why certain things might be difficult for you and can offer some useful advice potentially in that moment, or just some well-earned sympathy. And especially if you're starting in the industry, a lot of game designers are more than happy to share their knowledge and contacts with other designers. It's what I really love about the industry. People are very open generally, and that's what I try to be on this channel. If you ever see me at a convention, feel free to come up and ask me anything about game design. I'd be more than happy to help. And there are so many other designers who are absolutely as generous and open to this as I am. And so overall, going to a convention is such an amazing opportunity to meet all these people who are involved in the board game industry, either as players or as publishers or designers, and you get so much of that in the space of 3 or 4 days. It's something you just can't get in any other way. It's the main way that our industry hangs out together. Another big advantage of going to a convention, it's really a chance to both play games and to see games being played, even if you're not directly involved in the playing of the game. And as a designer, that's so vitally important. Often, so much of what we do working as a game designer is theoretical. We're working on games in our heads, we're making prototypes, we're doing all these activities that aren't actually playing a game. And also because we're often working on games which haven't been published yet, we're not really experiencing games in the way that the majority of the hobby experiences them. Gamers experience games by playing them, playing published games with real components, real artwork, and real rulebooks. And conventions can be a great opportunity to experience games as they're meant to be played, and to experience lots of games in a short period of time. Especially if you don't have a regular gaming group, conventions can be the only way you get to play games potentially and try new things out. That's certainly the case for me. I don't really have a regular game playing group. I don't really have that much time to play games anymore outside of designing them. So going to conventions can actually be my only chance of trying the new hot game that everyone's talking about and really helping me to understand why is it so good and why do people like it. Going into that a little bit further, I think it's so important to experience games being played in person in the moment, because games can create such surprising behavior in the moment that you wouldn't be able to theoretically understand or predict until you're actually playing the game. I think a great example of this for me is The Mind. The Mind is an incredible game that some people argue isn't even a game, where players are trying to effectively read each other's body language in order to play cards in a certain order without knowing what is in each other's hands. And when I read the rules or even saw videos about the game, I couldn't quite get it. I couldn't understand, why is this fun? What is the magic in it? And it was only in actually playing it and playing it at a convention with a large group of people that I could really understand the joy and the exhilaration that you get when you successfully play a bunch of cards in order together, and how that experience carries over from hand to hand and builds and builds. I wouldn't have been able to understand the true genius of the design of the Mind without that experience that happened at a convention. And you can multiply that across so many different games and types of games that you will be able to get to play. And there are even some styles of games, such as social deduction games or party games, that usually require a large number of players, that realistically, your best chance of playing them is at a convention. Another part of actually seeing games being played is when you go to a convention, it's a great opportunity to do some market research, especially if it's a chance with a large number of publishers who are there showing off the games that they've made. It can be a great chance for you to wander the halls and see what people are making. You'll be surprised how many games you've never heard of before, or in fact publishers you've never heard of before, that you'll walk past their table and look and see some amazing new game. It's a way to learn about it, it's a way to see what publishers are putting out, what type of themes, what types of styles of games they're making, and that can all go into informing your future design process. And this is especially important if you get to go to a convention that has a different market from the one you normally operate in, or the one of your own home country. I recall going to the Cannes International Game Festival, which is the main game festival in France, when I lived in the UK, and being so surprised at how many publishers and games I never heard of when I was walking around the halls. And that's because there's so many small publishers in France who publish games in French, and then these games often don't get localized into English or don't get exported into other countries. And so if I wasn't at Cannes and seeing those games, I would have never heard of them again. And not only did that give me potential contacts for other publishers I might be able to pitch games to in the future, it also let me experience a whole wealth of titles that I would have never heard of otherwise. And that I would put in little tips and tricks into my head about ideas I've seen in games that might inform future games I design. And even just seeing people of different cultures and different nationalities approaching how they play games. I remember going to other smaller French conventions and seeing the preponderance of outdoor games being a staple at all these festivals, which I hadn't seen in other more English-speaking conventions. And actually seeing how many games conventions were outside. You have PAL, the Paris Ludique Festival, which is the main festival in Paris, and that's held outside every year. Each of the publishers puts up marquees, but you're walking through a park essentially, so there's plenty of places to set up outdoor games that would be considered more mainstream. And you can see that that's a really important part of the French culture and how they consume games and consider them. And that can give you different insights into how you make games. And the last main advantage that I see as going to the convention, and especially the most important thing for me now at this point in my career, is that going to conventions is really my way of filling my game designer's cup. And in a lot of ways, it's much more of an emotional filling of the cup rather than a knowledge filling of the cup. I mentioned already that game designing can be pretty lonely. And not only can it be quite lonely, often you are working with other people. You're working with publishers or co-designers, but you're always working via email or Zoom or Discord. And as useful as these tools are, they never really fully replicate the experience of human interaction. And when your days are full of that type of interaction, it can be a special kind of draining. And if your whole job is doing that, it does add up over the days and weeks and months. And getting to go to conventions every few months or once a year is really a great way of breaking that routine and getting to refresh those relationships as they should be in person. And a particular point about that is that full-time game designers are pretty scarce. I don't know what the number would be around the world, but I have to imagine there are fewer than 1,000 people working as full-time game designers in the board game industry. And so conventions are really often the only way that you get to interact with other people who are really your colleagues, who are in the same type of position as you, that you get to share experiences and knowledge at that level. And often things will come up in conversation that you would have never thought to send an email about. And really, it's such a great way to form really deep friendships. And I feel myself really fortunate to have a lot of great friends in the game design community around the world. Conventions can also be a really great time to kind of step back and kind of realize where you've come. I think, especially in the early times when you're becoming a game designer, often you're so stuck in the kind of rat race of making prototypes, testing them, making them better, pitching them, getting rejected, making another prototype, testing it, making new games, etc., wash, rinse, repeat, that you don't take time to actually reflect on how far you've come and what you've achieved. Sometimes a convention can be a chance to get really good feedback on a prototype, or feedback from a publisher especially, which can really validate all that hard work you've done in designing it and working on it up to that point. And the other really big thing is once you've had a game that's published, a convention can be a great chance for you to see your game being played by other people in the wild that have nothing to do with you. And it still kind of blows my mind when I see that this thing that you've had such an intimate relationship with for often many years, to see it just existing and other people enjoying it completely independent of you. You didn't have to introduce it to them. I'm not ashamed to say that sometimes at conventions, if I see one of my games being played, I'll sort of sidle up and just watch for a little while, because it just reminds you that that's kind of the whole point of what you're doing as a game designer. Maybe you're a bit overwhelmed by the work, or you're just a bit burnt out on the project, that you can be left with somewhat lingering negative feelings about a published game. Even if the game is great, it can be hard to put those things out of your mind, and going to a convention and seeing the game played and people enjoying it can do a lot to restore that balance in how you see your work. And the last way that it really fills my cup going to a convention is that it's such a great source of inspiration. I can't remember who said this quote, but there's this idea of being a creative, that there's a time for putting creativity outside of yourself, that you're essentially outputting creative energy into the world, and that's when you're making things. And there's another time when you're taking creative energy in, and that's what informs your future creativity. It's what literally fills your cup that you had poured out to make the creations earlier. And conventions can do so much to kind of restart that creative appetite for me. There are so many different games, companies, people, publishers to interact with, that you can find ideas from such small snippets of conversation or interactions or observing something that you would just never have expected. And all of that kind of goes into your brain, and you start making new connections, and that's going to inform the new wave of games that you'll make after the convention. And it's such an efficient way to get that inspiration. It will take you a much longer time over many different interactions to get that without a convention, I think. It's a random example, but I remember when I was at Cannes one of the times, that I must have been so inspired by seeing certain narrative games or certain ways of doing them, that I'd had this idea for a game, and I remember sitting on the convention floor for a few hours making a prototype with paper and pen. And I've said in previous videos, I very rarely do that. And even crazier about this game is this game was very visual. It required illustrations, and I even made illustrations for this prototype. I'll try and show some on the screen if I can find them. And you'll see they're completely terrible. But I took this time to make the prototype. I did the entire thing in a few hours, and then I actually pitched it to a publisher like an hour after I'd finished making this first prototype. The game was pretty simple, and I knew the publisher fairly well. I wouldn't recommend doing that unless you know the publisher fairly well, and they were kind of happy to see whatever I was working on. And that game ended up becoming Bubble Stories, would you believe? It's the story for another video, but I don't think that game would have come about without that inspiration I was getting from just being at Cannes. So, I hope I've convinced you that there's a huge amount of amazing benefits you get from going to conventions, and that they're certainly worth the money that you need to spend to go to them. But we can't ignore the elephant in the room, and the fact is that as a cost as a game designer, going to a convention is maybe one of the biggest costs that you'll have in the year. In fact, as a professional game designer now, going to conventions is the most I spend as a game designer. So given that, are there some ways to potentially help with that cost, or maybe make it less of a burden? I have a few ideas. The first piece of advice I'd say is you don't have to go to the biggest conventions in the world. You don't have to go to Essen or Gen Con to get all the benefits I've talked about previously in this video. In fact, some of the smaller conventions are even better than the big conventions because they're just a bit more relaxed. You have more time to interact with the other people going to the convention. You have more chance that you're going to see them multiple times, that you're not all rushing around trying to get so much done, or that you all have so many meetings so you barely have time to talk to each other when you run into each other. These smaller conventions can just be so much more social and so much more laid back. And for some people who find being in big crowds really difficult, it's even more important to go to these smaller conventions. And so I would say don't dismiss them. When you're starting out in game design, I would seek out these smaller conventions, which usually will have a smaller financial burden. You can usually find ones that are much closer to wherever you live. You'll be surprised. I think you'll still get most of the benefits I've talked about, even going to these smaller conventions. They're really not to do with the size of the conventions. I mean, if you go to Gen Con or Essen, you're not going to interact with everybody going there anyway. Some smaller conventions that I've really enjoyed, I think Aircon in the UK is fantastic. It is getting bigger and bigger now, actually. When I went, it was probably smaller, but I think it's a really great mid-sized convention that's fantastic to go to. And in Australia, a few weeks ago, I went to PlayCon in Sydney. which I think is a really fantastic convention and does a lot to try and support designers especially. And I think it's a great option to go to if you're in Australia. If anyone has a great smaller convention that they go to that's close to wherever they live, please leave them down in the comments below and share them with everybody. And maybe if you're watching this video and you don't know about a local convention, you can find one in those comments. That being said, you still might live somewhere that's in a country which doesn't have a lot of conventions, or maybe none at all, or you live just a really far away from any convention that you might be able to go to. For example, in Australia, if you live in Perth, that's still a very far way away from Sydney, and it can still be really expensive to go to something like PlayCon. And in that case, I'd actually encourage you to try and create your own community, create your own convention experience. It doesn't have to be very big. It can just be for one day at some local place that hopefully you don't have to pay money to go to, maybe in a park or community center or a library. It doesn't have to be very big. You can just invite a handful of people. All these bigger conventions, they all started as very small, intimate gatherings, and it was just one or two people deciding that they wanted to start them. And that's how they started. And you can do the same thing. It's a bit similar to my video when I talked about forming your own playtesting group. You can create the thing that you're looking for in your own local community, and that can do a lot to ease the financial barrier to entry for going to conventions. And the last point is that yes, going to conventions is expensive, but you can prioritize it, and you don't have to go to conventions every year. So I would say if you're listening to this video and you've only just started designing, or you have a few prototypes that maybe you started pitching, maybe make a plan for next year to go to a big convention or to travel to something that is going to be a bit more expensive, but give yourself enough time to actually save towards that. You get so much from going to these conventions that they are worth prioritizing, they are worth saving for, and you can plan for them. You know the dates often long in advance, and if you talk to other people who have gone to these conventions or go onto forums where people talk about the events, you can often get a lot of good information about if you get in early enough with booking accommodation or travel, how you can save a lot of money. And of course you can find alternative accommodation agreements. Maybe you can share with other people to reduce the cost of that, or carpool with folks to get to a convention if you can drive. If you give yourself just more time in order to plan to go to a convention, often that can also help with the cost. So as always, I hope that video is useful. I hope I've convinced you that if you're going to spend money on something as a game designer, actually going to a convention could be one of the best things to use that money on. If you've had any great convention experiences or tips and tricks for going to conventions as a game designer, please do leave them down in the comments below. As always, I love the fact that we can all learn from each other on this channel from our own types of experiences that we've had. But until next time, thanks very much for watching, and all the best with your game designing. Bye.